From the Toronto Star, I'm Reggie Mudler, and this matters. The funny thing is, if you really wanted to find out what was going on between Google and Australia, the first thing that many of us would do is Google it. But due to an ongoing dispute, that might not be possible in the near future, at least if you live down under. Like many countries, Australia is looking at regulating big technology companies, and one of its approaches is coming up with a way for search engines and social media to compensate news publishers that are linked to on their platforms. There are several reasons that Google doesn't like this plan, but now the company is talking about potentially pulling its search engine from the country in retaliation. Now, before you can say, well, just Bing it, nothing has happened yet. But officials around the world and in Canada are watching this showdown as they prepare similar legislation and look at trying to regulate these giant technology companies and their platforms. Kieran Levitt is an Edmonton-based reporter for The Star. He's been following the story and joined us to discuss it and what it could possibly mean for Canada. Kieran, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Okay, so this is a fascinating topic because there is a ton of talk about regulation of big tech companies and what that might look like. So what we're going to talk about today is what Australia is attempting to do. And so, Kieran, let's just start with the basics. What exactly is the Australian government proposing?
Yeah, it's a really complex set of rules around making platforms like Google and Facebook pay for news media content that they use on their platforms. That is, in a nutshell, what they're trying to do. The nitty-gritty details are where it gets very complicated.
Well, let's talk about those nitty-gritty details because, obviously we all know, like, Google or Facebook share these articles sort of willy-nilly. That's where a lot of people find their news now. What is the nitty-gritty of this? How is this supposed to work?
Australia, right now, the proposal is that news media companies and Google basically should sit down and come up with a way for Google and also Facebook to pay for the news that shows up on their platforms. But if that can't happen, then an arbitrator steps in and a deal is worked out, just like you would have with a collective agreement or something. This is where it gets troublesome for Google and Facebook as well, who say, this arbitrator is going to be biased towards the news media companies. They're going to side with them in this arbitration process. And that's partly because Google believes that this arbitrator and the news media companies don't accept that Google provides this great distribution service for news websites, right? So you put up a link on Google, how many millions and millions of people are going to see it and click on it and potentially, go to a news website, and then that news website gets a reader and that reader sees ads on that website. Maybe they buy a subscription, right? Like, that's Google's argument. But what they're saying is that this arbitrator is not going to see it like that. And so what ends up happening is these negotiations will be unfairly decided in favor of a news media company. And on the flip side, right, news media companies are saying, fine, but that's totally fair because Google, you control a huge swath of the market. You're this massive company. The power imbalance is gigantic between us and you. So it's only fair that we have this arbitrator step in and work something out between us. There's multiple other proposals wrapped up in this, but I think that's the big one. And especially as it pertains to our conversation around what might happen in Canada, that's one worth studying.
Okay, now the thing is that obviously Google and Facebook, who talk about regulation, talk about self-regulation, but really have not had to face that much of it over time. This has really raised their ire. Now, the search engine giant in particular has made some threats. Tell me about those and what the reaction has been.
In its current form, the code remains unworkable, and if it became law, would hurt not just Google, but small publishers, small businesses, and the millions of Australians that use our services every day. There is a way forward that allows Google to pay publishers for value without breaking Google search and our business here in Australia. There are three concerns which I will touch on shortly, but the most critical of these is the requirement to pay for links and snippets in search. This provision in the code would set an untenable precedent for our business and the digital economy. It's not compatible with how search engines work or how the internet works. The principle of unrestricted linking between websites is fundamental to search, and coupled with the unmanageable financial and operational risk, if this version of the code were to become law, it would give us no real choice but to stop making Google search available in Australia.
Yeah, so all of these rules that are being talked about in Australia are not set in stone yet. They have been in front of the Senate in Australia, and Google, one of their spokespeople, told me that what happened in Australia was basically that Google's taken issue with all of these proposals. And so they've said, look, this is totally financially untenable for us. So we may have to pull our search engine services from Australia. And they just dropped that bomb. And the reaction in Australia, especially from the government, was, well, we're not going to respond to threats.
Australia makes our rules for things you can do in Australia. That's done in our parliament, it's done by our government, and that's how things work here in Australia. And people who want to work with that in Australia, you're very welcome. But we don't respond to threats.
And so we've been left at this kind of standoff where Google has threatened to pull their search engine. Australia has said, great, calling their bluff, basically. And most recently, Google was sort of called out for, apparently, Google described it as an experiment, quote unquote, where they made news media websites unavailable or buried in their search results when people go on and use their search engine. And you can kind of look at it in different ways. Google said, this is normal. We do this stuff all the time. We switch things around in how our algorithm works. And this has nothing to do with the fact that the government is considering putting regulations in Australia that is going to affect us directly, right? But others have said this is just a flex by Google. This is just them being like, look how powerful we are. And if you mess with us, this is what's going to happen.
Okay, so what does a world or a country look like without Google search? Because the other thing is that there's other search engines. I mean, people make a joke about it, but there's Microsoft Bing. Yahoo is still out there. So I don't understand, if they pull their search, are the other players still going to be there? Or, how are they enforced? And the other thing is couldn't I just fire up a VPN and say I'm somewhere else and then use Google search to my heart's content if I was in Australia?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And it's one I've been talking to people about over the last week. And yes, to all of the above. I mean, Bing is a search engine that is perfectly viable for people to use, as well as there's DuckDuckGo. I believe Yahoo search is still a thing. So, not to say that I have any inside information on what those companies are planning or anything, but I'm sure if Google just pulled its search engine, we all need to search things. Google search is such a ubiquitous part of our lives. It's crazy to me how often I just open up Google and start using it and don't even think about it. Even writing these articles about Google, I'm using Google search constantly. So what happens if Google all of a sudden just leaves? Will they is the number one question, because you've got these markets that are massive. Australia is worth billions of dollars. Canada is worth billions of dollars. If you just say, okay, we're going to leave all that money on the table, who knows if they'll actually do that? If they do, who knows how the public's going to react? I think there's a huge question mark there. I don't know how much this stuff is reverberating through the conversations over the dinner table right now in Canada and Australia. I have some friends in Australia who I've talked to about this, and I've said, hey, is this a thing? Are you really paying attention to this big fight that's happening between your government and Google? And they're all like, oh yeah, I heard about that the other day. But of course, our news cycle moves so quickly, people don't continue to pay attention. So it's really hard to say what would happen. Yes, you could use a VPN and probably just use the United States version of Google. Yes, Bing would probably see a massive uptick in traffic of Canadians who are all of a sudden left in the dark without Google search. Yes, maybe they're able to fully bring in those people and then, they become the next Google. The sky is really the limit here. It's really hard to say how that would all shake out. The other question too is if Google pulls its search engine, which is deeply intertwined with things like Google Maps, do we lose Google Maps? I've lived in the same city for almost 3 years, and I still use Google Maps almost every time I drive somewhere. So there's all kinds of repercussions that could happen there, I think.
We'll be right back. Well, I think the other really interesting thing about it is that, Australia's approach still feels to me pretty open in that while they are sort of mandated to come up to an agreement, and I guess forced arbitration is never a nice, fun thing, it still is letting the company negotiate. Like, has there been any talk about what the value is? Because I would also think that in Google's instance here, they would probably be fearful of setting a precedent on exactly what linking to a news article costs, because then that's something that can happen worldwide, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's the big question is how much is it worth? And you've got these differing opinions because for Google or Facebook is a good example as well. Someone will post an article on Facebook and it'll be a photo, it'll be a headline, it'll be a little synopsis of what the article's about. And then, on Facebook, that'll be shown up alongside ads. So how much money is the company making based on the fact that they can have that content on their platform beside ads? I mean, how much is that worth? We really don't know. Then on the other side, how much is it worth to news companies who have these massive distribution platforms like Google and Facebook, where their content gets shared far and wide? I can go click on an article that was published by a local newspaper in Australia right now. How valuable is that? So you're totally right in asking that question. I think it'll be interesting to see how that gets worked out, if it gets worked out. It is a fairly open process, but you can look at France for maybe a model that Google prefers, where they actually have agreed to enter into agreements with news companies there in that country because the agreement structure is different. There's no arbitrator that eventually would step in if an agreement can't be reached between the companies and Google. And the framework that they're using is different in the way that it puts a value on the content. So in France, Google will consider how much content is worth based on data points. So how much has the article or articles contributed to the public conversation? How much has it been shared? You can kind of look at all these different things and sort of say, well, it's worth this much, or your content generally is worth this much based on our data that we collect on your stuff. So my understanding on how that's worked out in France is that Google's way more willing to be part of that sort of structure rather than Australia, where it's like, come to an agreement or we're going to have an arbitration process.
And the France stuff literally was just passed a couple of weeks ago, I believe January 21st. Although it was one of those things too, I believe it also sort of wound its way through many, many iterations and they weren't too happy about it during that process. So I guess we have to wait and see how that is going to turn out. But basically that's another one where they sort of voluntarily had to sort of figure this stuff out and have come to a model that they like. We're around the world. Let's move this to Canada. The Canadian government has been talking about something like this for a while. I'm sure that they're looking at these approaches around the world. What can you tell us about it, at least specifically from the news front? Because I want to talk about the larger online stuff a little bit more later.
Yeah, so specifically on news, there hasn't been a ton in terms of publicly released information around what the Canadian government wants to do on this front. They are following closely what's happening in Australia. I know the Heritage Minister, Stephen Guilbeault, is talking with people in Australia and officials in Australia all the time about how things are going there. He's been looking at what happened in France, and it's really an international conversation that Canada's involved in. So I know that they're considering all these different things, and we'll see exactly what the plan is, whether it's exactly similar to what Australia has done, or if it's closer to what France has done, or if it's something completely different. He has called it a plan that is a made in Canada plan. So we'll see if it's unique, if it's similar, if it's the exact same. We don't know yet.
The other thing is, just recently wrote a really great piece talking about a number of changes as to how Canadians might be able to get some action on policing social media. I want to talk about that because, these things are related. They're not the same, but all of our lives are online now. And I think this is just some really interesting talk about how to maybe deal with some stuff like hate speech. What are some of the things that they are considering that might be coming along on that front?
Yeah, so this is a much more urgent issue in terms of timing. These changes are expected this month or next month. So within weeks, the Canadian government's expected to table some legislation that would put in place a watchdog, basically. It's a regulator that would oversee how online platforms and internet companies operate and what ends up on those platforms in terms of illegal content. So specifically hate speech, child sexual abuse content, non-consensual intimate images, those types of things are rampant on the internet. unfortunately. And the companies themselves can't police all that content. So it's a really big issue that the government has decided to try and tackle. So they're going to put in place this watchdog that is going to have a set of regulations that just sort of enshrines what these companies can and cannot have on their websites. And we know that it's going to be structured around how long this content's allowed to be on the platform. So for instance, this applies to all internet companies, Twitter, Facebook, Pornhub, which has been in the news a lot because its parent company, MindGeek, is based in Montreal. If there's illegal child sexual abuse content that crops up on Pornhub, for instance, that has to be removed within 24 hours. And if it's not, then that company could get in trouble with the Canadian government if it's not removed. And that applies to Twitter with hate speech, right? That's the really kind of prickly one, because hate speech, we all know it's really hard sometimes to define what exactly is hate speech. So it's an open question. How do you police that? If somebody posts hate speech on Twitter and the Canadian government decides that Twitter hadn't done enough to remove that piece of content, then you could find yourself in a situation where Twitter argues that it's not hate speech. Maybe the Canadian government thinks it is hate speech. Maybe the person who posted it doesn't think it's hate speech. Maybe the broader public does think it's hate speech. You're in this dilemma. So it's going to be complicated on that front. Further to that, there's some processes we know that they're looking at, like they want to give law enforcement more powers to go after information that exists within these private companies like Facebook and Google and Twitter. We don't know what those are yet, but I know that it's an idea they've been bouncing around in the ministry. They've talked about having an appeals process and a complaint process. So if you feel as though a company is not acting in the right way under these government regulations, you can complain to the government. If you feel as though your content that you've posted has been removed unjustly and you feel like the company has acted unfairly towards you, you can appeal your case to the government. That's another thing they're thinking about doing. Some of these things are ideas that are being finalized. The things we know for sure that they're setting up a brand new regulator to oversee this stuff. So we'll have to wait and see what is actually tabled and the debate that ensues after that.
Well, it's funny, a lot of this stuff has been out there for years, and regulation of social media and big technologies has been talked about over and over again. What do you think is different this time around?
Well, I think there's a few things. I think it's been talked about quite a bit, but I think you're seeing now action from governments across the world. That's one of the big things. Australia pulled the trigger on doing some of this stuff in the online world. And I think it's caused conversation, and then it's caused other governments to think, okay, well, now we have something to analyze. You've had some pretty high profile things happen in North America. I mean, the storming of the Capitol earlier in January has everybody, I think, talking about freedom of speech online and policing, what we saw up in the lead up to those riots, organized groups who are setting out to be violent, that it has everybody concerned about how that affects democracy. So there's been that. There's been a lot of news, I think, as well on the illegal content being spread online. So that's caused a stir in the media and the broader public conversation. And also just the fact that as it pertains to particularly Canada, it's something the Liberal government has been interested in doing for years. I think it's just they're finally now doing it. These things are actually going to be tabled in Parliament, and the ideas and the plans are going to be talked about.
There's a lot of big things we're talking about. And the thing is that, at least particularly with the hate speech stuff and the regulation, I'm absolutely all for it. I do think people need to have avenues to rectify what is said about them online, particularly if there is, some truly defamatory stuff. I mean, back to the news thing, this is one of these things where, I can kind of see both sides of this thing. I love the fact that the internet is this big, wide open thing that you can find anything on, but I work in the news. I can also see where my bread is buttered. It's obviously very expensive to create, and Google and Facebook have been using this without any sort of compensation for a really long time. I think the thing here is finding a way to strike some sort of right balance. Do you see any signs of that?
Yeah, I think that there's a way to strike a balance. Some wouldn't say so. I mean, there are people on the extremes who think that Google needs to just pay up. Like they should just stop fighting and just pay up because they have a massive share. There's no argument about how much money Google makes or how much money they make from advertising. And a lot of it's advertising that used to go to news media companies. So, I mean, you can kind of follow that argument of like news media companies are dying. They have been for a long time. And a lot of the money that they used to have to operate is now in the hands of Google. So Google should give a little bit back because they also use news media content. The other side of that argument is people who believe that news media companies need to get with the times and think that, this downfall of the news media has been happening for years, long before Google and Facebook came around. They need to figure out how to bring in revenue without trying to take on big tech. That's another opinion that exists. The middle of that, I think, is probably something around like what France has decided to do. It's clear from the way that Google and Facebook have been talking, even in Australia, that there is a middle ground. There are things that the company is willing to pay for news. It's shown that in France, and it's said that. So, is it going to be enough for news companies? We don't know. Is it going to be fair and equitable? We don't know. There's a lot that the jury is very much still out on a lot of this stuff. But yes, I do think that there's a middle ground. I do think that Canada has an opportunity here, if this is the road it wants to go down, to maybe find that middle ground. And we'll really have to wait and see. I'll be excited to keep talking to you about this and to others about this, because I think this is just the beginning in our country. It'll be really interesting to see if there's a battle here, or if Google and Facebook are going to accept what the Canadian government tries to do in terms of paying news companies for the content they produce.
Well, like I said, we'll definitely all be watching with bated breath. Kieran, I really, really want to thank you for your time today.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat and for being interested in the topic. Thank you.
Kieran Levitt is an Edmonton-based reporter for The Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Raju Mudler, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisaz. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.